So listen, thank you so much for joining us here today. And I want to thank you, and also want to thank you for the contribution you made to my book. And we'll talk about a great little book that you've written as well later. But perhaps I think it would be worthwhile quickly introducing you to some of the folk here that are in the Ford scene, because you're known so much for your Renault work, but maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your background with Ford.
Yes, of course. Well, I'm a Frenchman, but basically I'm a mongrel because my father was French. He was a colonel in the French Foreign Legion. And my mother came from Brittany, from Lancashire. And when my father died, when I was 12, my mother sent me to Britain, and I went to school and I learned to speak English. And then I continued to college and basically spent all of 20 years living outside of France. And then I began in a company which has disappeared, which I had nothing to do with. That was Simca. And then afterwards, I went to Ford Motor Company, and there I stayed 17 years. So it's a very, very long time. I began as an interior designer, went into exterior design, and then went all the way through the ranks to become the chief designer of Ford Germany. And I was, in fact, being groomed to become the successor to Uwe Barnson. And then I left for some reason. and I moved on to the Volkswagen Audi group, and then later to Renault, where I spent 22 years.
That's an amazing amount of time. And I've always found it interesting when we've talked that you say to me, you learned everything that you know from Ford. And I think you're known so much for Renault, but what is it that you felt you learned from Ford?
Well, Ford was an incredibly professional organization at the time. Namely, I'm not saying that it's not today, but by comparison to the other companies, it was way ahead in all ways, be it in all manners, be it in organization, in terms of the positioning of design, in terms of the materials used, the techniques employed. Everything was just so far ahead of anybody else at the time. Hence the reason why Ford designers were so popular, and people were constantly trying to hire Ford designers.
So I've always felt that was a very special era of Ford design under Uwe Barnson, your boss. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about the creative spirit and Uwe Barnson, the man himself, and the cars that you created, because I'm sure people would love to know exactly what were the cars created under your time there.
Okay, well, Uwe Barnson was a great leader. There's absolutely no doubt about it. He came from a background. He was, in fact, unusual, I would say, for a car designer, because he was a show window, in shops designer. He went into automobile design, having been identified because of rallying activity. He went through the ranks, and he was a very business-oriented guy, very open. One of the things that I love about the man is that he listened to people. So I thoroughly enjoyed working for him, because intellectually he was quite a brilliant individual. Fought for the various projects, was always ready to push for some advanced ideas. As for myself, well, I worked on many different programs. I've worked. People say that I'm responsible for the Taunus Cortina, the second one, not the one with the nuts and notes, but the one that came thereafter, as well as the Granada. Later, I was responsible for the Ford Cargo, the truck, and then, of course, worked on the Sierra. I've worked on facelift of the Fiesta. I've worked on and some of the great cars at that time, namely the XR2. And I continued working until I left, in fact, in 1985. I've been responsible for an awful lot of cars, but sometimes I being the designers, other times being either a manager or whatever.
That's a good point that you make, because, as you know, everybody always credits one person. Always a team. Yeah.
I always like to quote when I can remember the names of all the people that were involved, because that can be extremely frustrating for those who tend to be forgotten.
So you mentioned the Sierra, and as you know, that's a car I featured in my book, and the Mark III Escort Erica. Both cars were big jumps over the vehicles that they replaced.
Yes.
What was the sense of spirit and risk? Did you feel that Sierra was a bigger risk over Taunus Cortina, or was Escort Mark III a bigger risk over Escort Mark II? I mean, what were you guys feeling and thinking when you made those leaps?
Well, both were very strong statements, product statements, design statements. Mm-hmm. I think the Erica was really the torch, the flame. This was the first one where there was a very, very powerful idea. It was beyond just doing a nice styling job. It really just changed the type of cars that, it was very much different from what was being produced at the time, with this little bustleback. Had a very strong architecture, clearly very, very different to the old rear-wheel drive Escort, which basically was kind of an awkward car. It sat on little wheels with a wheelbase which was a little too narrow, and of course the Escort, the Erica, was just a lovely piece of architecture, as was the Golf one when the first Golf when it came out. The Sierra was built upon the ambition, or the ambition built up as a result of the Escort. So it was one step forward. We felt we had made a big, strong statement with the Escort, and we wanted to continue. And basically, we wanted to acquire design leadership in Europe.
That's an impressively bold thing to try and strive for a mass market manufacturer.
Yes, indeed. But we felt that we were not BMW, so we didn't have this sort of aura associated with the mechanics, even though, of course, on the sporting side, we were so successful and so damn good. But in fact, we were doing, average cars, and we felt, what with the success of the Escort Erica, that when it came to the Sierra, we were prepared to make one big step forward. And we all felt that aerodynamics, the influence of aerodynamics, was going to become a big, strong issue. And so we built up the whole image of that car on this notion of it doing a slippery form, which was a big change from the past Cortina, Taunus and Cortina.
So you mentioned Erica and the sporting heritage of the company. Tell me a bit about the XR3. How did that come to be versus just a regular Escort S, and why it wasn't an RS? What was the background? Who designed that car?
So the car was designed by Klaus Kapitza. He was the man in the background, very much so. And Klaus Kapitza has been a designer who's been present on many of the more advanced projects. But what I can say about the car, the man behind the car in this particular instance, the XR3 I'm talking about, is Uwe Bahnsen. Uwe Bahnsen felt strongly that we should not continue doing the type of cars that our management were accustomed to. Must remember that there were an awful lot of Americans very much present at the time, and often these Americans came for a very short period. And he, being a European amongst Europeans, felt that we should not take our cues from US market, but we should develop the more European approach. And the European approach was more a Porsche-like approach. Mm-hmm. And also, I think Uwe Bahnsen was very much aware, or at the back of his eye, he looked at the Golf 1, the GTI, and he felt this was really going to be it. And he very much fought to go in this direction of a very sportive vehicle, which was not based upon just lots of striping.
Mm. And it was certainly a very sophisticated car. But the thing that always stands out was some of the iconic elements of XR3, like the strobe fabric seats. What's the story behind them?
Well, that's a funny story because, in reality, this fabric was designed for the cargo truck, would you believe, and management just loved it. They saw it, they discovered this stripe, and of course the striped seat, and of course the cargo was going to be coming out on the market later, and they fell so much in love with this fabric design that they just pushed out of the way all the others and said, well, this is the one that we want. And so it was, it was taken out of our studio where we were designing the truck. And fortunately, we were allowed to keep it ourselves as well. So it was funny that you had on the one hand the super XR3 model, and then a Ford Calgo about a year later coming up with the same stripe or the same seats, I would say.
Love it. So I want to talk particularly about the XRs, and maybe another day we'll look at the RS cars during your time. But XR2 was the next car born under the sort of the XR range. Where was that car conceived? Was that done in Dunton as a colour and trim project, or was that done in Germany, in Merkenich? What was the story of XR2?
Well, the XR2, of course, the design and development was done in Germany. I was, in fact, the design chief at the time. It was very much following on from the XR3 in terms of philosophy, if one can use this word. The car was not to be overly decorative. We wanted, we had the right architecture, the wheels were in the right position and so on and so forth. We had made the front end look much more solid. So we didn't want to be overwhelmed with lots and lots and lots of graphics. In my memory, but I'm not sure, it could be that I'm wrong, but I believe that the graphics, the super RX2 graphics was done by a Canadian designer called Mark Conforti, who I recall his sketches, very vividly. I remember these sketches, and the whole car was just done as a little bit of an understatement, but the presence of the car was so strong that it didn't need overwhelming, stripes all over the thing. It was just, it's one of my favorite cars. I must say, I love that car.
Lovely looking car, and it came off of the back of the Fiesta Super Sport, and I always think they're sort of yin and yang, those two cars.
Sure, absolutely.
But one of the differences was the pepper pot wheels that were used on Capri as well. What's the story with those pepper pot wheels? Were they?
I think this was if I may say so, a very, very bold and gorgeous design.
Yeah.
I believe it also comes from Mark Conforti, but I'm not 100% sure. Right. But the reason why I think that Mark was behind it is because the car is extremely graphic, with these balls. It was very, very much of a bold design statement. And it looked super on the Fiesta, and it looked equally as good on the Capri, of course. It actually made it was not an easy design to sell, because it was so extraordinarily different to anything that had been done before. But once we put the actual design on the car. Mm-hmm. Then there was absolutely no argument. The arguments went when we had a lineup of different designs, but then we were able to move them. They were on plots and so on, and we moved the wheel inside the wheel arch, and then there was no argument. Yes, that was it. That was the design.
Terrific. It was a terrific design. Loved it. So the other thing that's sort of one of the more iconic parts of the XR cars, as I say, we'll come back to RS another day, is the biplane spoiler. And I always find it fascinating. You and I have talked about it before, but maybe you can tell people about where that biplane spoiler started and its relationship with Probe 3.
Now, we had a very, very good aerodynamicist, whom I've forgotten his name, unfortunately. But this fellow was not short of good ideas and sometimes quite outlandish ideas in terms of aerodynamics. And he worked very, very closely with one of our designers, Klaus Kapitza. And they developed a first spoiler, which was pretty, quite efficient, but it was, laid on the deck lid. It had the down pressure necessary. But we found by experimenting that putting a second spoiler, and we moved at various heights, that it really improved quite dramatically the aerodynamic performance of the car. Now, it has to be said that the reality is that this double-decker spoiler was designed before the Probe 3. The Probe 3 was a vehicle that responded to a Frankfurt Motor Show theme that had been developed on efficiency, on fuel economy. You know, we were going through one of the many crises associated with the impending catastrophe with the lack of petrol supply, and the Pro 3 itself was a vehicle which responded as the other manufacturers had, and we elected to show the spoiler with the Pro 3, which helped us to, in fact, make sure that we would get it later on the XR4.
Ah, okay. So
okay.
Some people tend to say that the Pro 3 was a prototype Sierra, but maybe you can just tell us a little bit of background behind the car and its role, and did it succeed in what you hoped for?
Well, it's often the case that a prototype would lead to an influence on the sedan. In this particular case, the Sierra was already developed. The tooling was, on its way, and we took the opportunity to do this show car because of the theme that had been developed for the Frankfurt Motor Show. So, in fact, it was not really a program that came before Sierra. It came a long way before, and it became a very good means of communicating, our first communication about our new vehicle or the design direction that we were taking. Because you must remember, you must imagine that at that time we were a little bit anxious about how the car was going to be, received by the market. So this was a super opportunity that we had, and we had very good response from both the press and the public, which was a help. We felt much better as a result. So
it was just a year after TC3 Mark V Cortina. I mean, it was a big leap for sure.
It was a big step, yeah, absolutely.
So I just wanted to think about maybe some of the things that you wanted to do on those cars, particularly the XR, since we're talking about them here. Was it anything that you would have liked to have done more on the XR 2, 3, or 4?
The only quibbles that we had was more to do with the architecture of the vehicle, or namely the positioning of the wheels to the body, which was something that designers harp on about, but exteriorizing them as much as possible, the wheels. And for example, we didn't feel quite happy on the Sierra, on the XR4i. In many ways, we felt that the XR2 was a better, better positioning of wheels, which it makes such an enormous difference on the perception of road rolling, of the car being on the road and firmly sat on the road. So yes, we've had all the way along. We had quibbles about the overall architecture, lowering the car slightly and pushing the wheels out. But I must say that we, apart from these physical things that we were not it was impossible to do for many reasons because of tooling and so on and so forth. There was overall a very receptive. I mean, I can't say that I've lived through a period where this was not a period of to be frustrated as a designer. The period beforehand, yes, I could tell you many stories about that. But in that times when there were people like Uwe Barnson and Bob Lutz, no, it was I think we did quite well at that time.
I'm sure people love some of those designs to this day. I know they do, and I've spoken to them at the show, so I couldn't disagree. So he promised me to ask, When you left for VW Audi and then obviously to what were your many decades with Renault, what did you take with you of the spirit of those cars and how it could be used in the other products you worked on later in your career?
Well, for Volkswagen, you know, I joined Volkswagen hired by the president at the time, Karl Hahn, whose intention was to name me the first head of group design. At the time, the company was made up of only Volkswagen, Audi, and Seat. What I did do is I did work on a product philosophy for Seat, where I wanted it to, in fact, get a bit of that Latin spirit and of being more expressive, which I felt was what we were doing so well at Ford. And I think that the sort of performance oriented was something which we were hoping to put into the Seat brand of the future. In Renault, different story, a company which was much more interested in vehicle concepts, even though we did little by little, you know, come up with some rather interesting sporting vehicles. In many ways, one can say that there's a bit of the XR feeling in some of those later projects. They were not, you know, covered with stripes or whatever. It was really just they were usually rather good, you know, packages. Wheels were in the right location, and so on and so forth. So the spirit of the Ford RS spirit was something that stayed with me for, you know, for many years, because it basically it was just right, you know, it was the right thing to do.
There's always a slight madness in Renault sports products with the mid-engine cars and the spiders. A bit like Ford there, it always sort of went off and did them. So I always
we did crazy things,
crazy stuff.
Yeah.
So when you look back on the XR cars, what's the things that you remember and you love of some of the iconic treatments or stories from their design?
Well, what I do recall is that we always had an XR vehicle in our family range, you know. So it was, to me, they were highly desirable cars with the right package. They were not over the top in terms of decorative elements. I think that the influence of Overbounce at that time, and of course Bob Lutz, was so powerful. And for many years, the XR products were just, in my mind, just really perfect products. And as I said, you know, we always had in our family an XR vehicle. So no, they were just thoroughly nice packages, you know, just an overall very good cars and pleasant to drive as well.
Yes. No, they were never too extreme, but they were always had a great sense of style. So, and one of the things I've enjoyed recently is reading through your other lovely book, and I know we've both enjoyed talking while you were doing yours and I was doing mine. That's a lovely trip through some of your experiences in your career. What's the couple of the Ford stories that you can remember there that might interest the people watching here?
Well, there's an awful lot of stories in there about my days in Ford. After all, you know, 17 years in that company, and I had some great experiences working sometimes for individuals who came directly from the United States and had difficulty adapting to the European environment, and were coming all continuously with their, you know, American influence and trying to push us Europeans to do that, including, you know, all the soft field vinyl roofs and so on. That one of the nice stories I recall, and I tell that in my book. Can I show you my book? By the way,
why not? There you go. Hold it up.
It's called Design Between the Lines. Okay, and it's in English, of course, and it's a book which has been published in Great Britain. But I tell a story that one of the incredible encounters I had was with Mr. Ford. I went to the United States to make a presentation on a car that we had designed when I was working in Great Britain, and it was a very successful meeting. it was one of the last meetings where there were two bit of legends, Iacocca and Henry Ford. And Mr. Ford invited us in the evening to the dining room in WHQ, and we went up the lift, and the lift opened, and there was Mr. Ford, and he welcomed us. And as I walked on this carpet. It was so thick. It felt as if you were walking on fresh snow, and it was the man was at a very good and dry sense of humor. I went past a fantastic large impressionist painting, and I said to him, "Oh, is that a Sisley?" And he said, "Oh, I don't know. It's written on the right hand side at the bottom," and he really had a very dry sense of humor. So yes, in my book, there's an awful lot of stories about my time spent in Ford. As I said, they were my formative years. So yeah, there was plenty to talk about. There is plenty to talk about.
Listen, this has been great, Patrick. I think it would be lovely to see if people enjoy this. Maybe we'll do it again as a live session. People can type in questions and do the RS cars another time. But this has been great to chat, and I'm sure people will enjoy watching this and hearing some of your stories. It's been terrific. So listen, thank you so much for your time. We'll do it again.